Welcome back to Mental Health, where we tackle social issues, politics, and pop culture through a mental health lens. It's that time, people. You're probably sick of hearing the name, but I could not resist talking about this hopefully in a different way than the angle from which the press has been coming at it. But it's time to talk about Jussie Smollett. And because the discussion of this topic kind of went a little bit short, and I'm fine with that, honestly. I'm all about brevity and hopefully quality over quantity. But as a result, I ended up taking 2 short episodes and combining them together for this one. So after we talk about Jussie, I'm going to transition to a different but somewhat related topic of activism. So if you don't know who Jussie Smollett is, let me give you a really quick TLDR version of what happened. This is an actor from Empire. He received some sort of death threat on set in the form of a letter that had like white powder on it and had a crude drawing of a stick figure being hanged and veiled threats of harm to his person. And then later on, he told the police that he had been attacked by 2 people in Chicago late at night who had screamed out, "This MAGA country," and followed that with calling him the N-word and potentially some comments towards him being a homosexual as well. Now, if that sounds a little bit on the nose, that's because it is. Now, let me just, of course, say hate crimes absolutely do happen. They are a real thing, but this is not one of them, as far as we know at this point, because the evidence stacked up very quickly. What seems to be the case, and now Jussie has actually been formally arrested and charged, the timeline seems to be that Jussie hired 2 friends and actors, also from the show, people that he knew. And mind you, these are 2 black individuals, apparently of Nigerian descent. Very much not the white Trump supporters you might have pictured from the "This is MAGA country" statement. Paid them by check and staged this whole thing. And it's very sad for a number of reasons. But once again, it's easy to get lost in the story itself. But once more, I find myself asking the all-important question of why. That's the only question that can really help us learn from this and understand the forces that lead to these kinds of behaviors. If you want to hear more about the story itself, there are thousands and thousands of podcasts and interviews and YouTube videos out there that you can check it out. But we're going to really zero in once again on this question of why did this happen? Now, while I imagine more will come out in the future given the high-profile nature of this case, I couldn't find a whole lot on Smollett's childhood and his kind of long-term history. All I know is that he's biracial. He was born to a Jewish father and a black mother and is one of 6 siblings. Beyond that, I at this point, not that I looked super hard, but as I was digging around Google, that was all I could turn up on his childhood. I didn't have any sort of indication that there were any problems growing up or reports of abuse or, trauma, because that's my focus always. What did stand out to me and interest me is that he started his road to acting at age 5, so very young. And his first big role was in The Mighty Ducks in 1992, which was a movie I was a big fan of, still enjoy watching to this day, but that's neither here nor there. What do we know about child acting in the 90s? Mostly not good stuff, right? Not well regulated, poor supervision, lots of bad experiences. I mean, I only really need to throw out a name like Macaulay Culkin to tell you that there is a track record, especially in the 80s and 90s, of child acting going very south. Plenty of reports of physical and sexual abuse, attending inappropriate parties, access to drugs, so on and so forth. Now, again, there's no accounts that this happened to Jussie, but when I placed him at that age in that space, that's where my brain immediately went. Even though if that's not the case, it doesn't take a genius to recognize that growing up in the Hollywood world is going to alter your perception of the world. You're surrounded by fantasy. You're in this bubble of largely like-minded individuals, and also around a lot of people that are older than you. Your peers largely are going to become adults in that situation. So instead of having the normal socialization of playing with other kids your age, you're going to spend a lot of time being directed around and interacting with people that are not of your age group. You're not likely getting the same basic attachment experiences because you're busy all day on set acting. And if you're successful in your acting career, you're going to start learning that things come easy instead of through necessarily really hard day-to-day work. We can think of plenty of examples of how becoming wealthy too quickly ended up creating more issues for that person, and their personality may even change. Their attitude towards other people may change. And especially I feel like if you are born into wealth, or if you develop wealth early on and you miss that experience of like having to get a part-time job, having to babysit and wash cars, going through regular school days, and having to learn to interact with your peers. If you miss those experiences, it's leaving this gaping hole in your development that's not going to leave you a fully functioning adult. And I'd argue that all of that really does a number on your level of empathy for others in particular. I've talked previously about stories of how especially early development issues and attachment and neglect and all that stuff can play into underdevelopment of those areas that are associated with having empathy. So this is my very early hypothesis of what's going on with Jussie. And again, this isn't based on a wealth of information. It's not highly researched. This is just my little hypothesis of what I think is going on here. But if we think about it, someone willing to put others in his own community under the bus by lying, making his supporters look like fools, and ultimately taking limited police resources for his own personal gain lacks some fundamental care for others. We're talking about a man whose actions may lead to real cases of hate crimes in the future being met with cynicism. And if the timeline of events is true, the amount of foresight involved here and subsequent opportunities to stop and say, you know what, wait a minute, this is kind of awful. This is kind of a bad thing to do. Maybe there's going to be some fallout for this. Maybe somebody's going to get hurt. It's pretty staggering. Sociopathic even. You hire two supposed friends and coworkers, pay them by check, plan out this whole narrative, put together the letter, scope out the area where this supposed attack is going to happen, so on and so forth. There were so many chances for reason to prevail here, and it didn't. He continued to pursue his focus, the thing that was going to help him for some reason. And then the other aspect of this is the political angle. And for this, there seem to be two major ways to look at it. Number one, Jussie was only looking out for himself and saw an opportunity to exploit current political unrest to meet his needs. Or two, Jussie was very much honestly wrapped up in a political ideology and took that seriously and saw this story as a means in his mind to bring that issue to a head, to bring it to the forefront and be the face of a cause. And it's could be and is likely maybe a combination of both of those things. We don't really know. We may never know, since he's still denying responsibility. But this is exactly why I find the current media discourse around the political divide to be so dangerous and irresponsible. Like I've discussed in a previous podcast, we have turned victimhood into a currency. And some human beings will do anything to gain whatever currency they find to be of most current value at that time to them. In this case, on some level, and again, it's not clear why, maybe he'll tell us the full story at some point, but it seems to me that he recognized somehow in this situation that claiming this victim status was going to have some value either to him or to his community or to people on his political side. He has friends in politics. Whatever the exact motive, Jussie recognized that his actions would garner attention since it strikes a chord in the current zeitgeist. And that's a system we've created. We have developed this toxic world where people are trying to cash in on the pain and suffering of other people. And I'm not at all saying that we shouldn't acknowledge very real racism, misogyny, injustices, and any number of other issues that are still happening. There are still problems out there, big time, that need to be solved. That's why I do this podcast. I want to raise awareness for actual viable solutions. But I strongly believe that the current format of debate that points fingers and focuses on assumptions of ill intent is counterproductive and creates more problems than it solves. People are angry, and often rightly so, but as I've said in multiple episodes regarding hostile attributions, confirmation bias, and then just basic brain-level responses to trauma, acting on emotions alone does not create long-term sustainable solutions. We have real problems to solve, and we can't do so when we're so blinded by hatred of a specific group and our own ideology that it is stunting our ability to do that. We're creating a wall that's actually counterintuitive. It's not allowing us to reach our intended goal. Just as KKK members are missing massive amounts of information in their way of thinking that's blinding them from their ability to function as positive members of society, so too are people with so-called Trump, or in this case Trump supporter, derangement syndrome. It's just another form of confirmation bias and hostile attribution bias. They're so tied up in this idea of what these people are that they've created this caricature in their head of what they are, and then they start to act accordingly in terms of that. Instead of interacting with a real human being, they're already projecting their view of what this person is and how they think and how they go about their way and responding to that. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. If I'm thankful of one thing in this situation, it's that Jussie was seemingly so blinded by his limited viewpoint of these people that he perceives as others that his story ended up degrading into, quite frankly, like a Snidely Whiplash cartoon. It seems like he had this caricature in his head of what a Trump supporter is. And again, not to say that there aren't Trump supporters out there that would say things and do things like this, but he had this very two-dimensional idea in his head of what this would play out as. As a result, his account read more like a middle schooler's hero story fanfiction than reality. And while I was willing to hold my tongue until more information came out, so many people from all sides of the social and political spectrum recognized that something smelled fishy about this. It was just a little bit too just so. I have to question the reasoning of a grown adult who thought that this plan was actually going to work. In any case, I hope that he is held fully accountable, but like anyone I discuss here, I hold him no ill will. I don't think he's a bad person. I've said before, I don't really believe in bad people. I believe in people that make poor decisions and do bad things. Clearly, there is something wrong with him, and he needs help. But that, again, should serve as an explanation and not an excuse. I have to say that it does bother me to hear people like Don Lemon state sympathy for him, not because they're wrong. We should have some level of sympathy for him. But what bothers me is that their own social bubble that they're in doesn't allow them the same courtesy to wrongdoers that they see as ideological enemies. Anytime somebody from the opposite side of the political spectrum does something wrong, it's immediately, they're evil, they're a terrible person, they're a bigot, they're a racist. It's these very broad spectrum labels. But when it's a friend, when it's someone they know, when it's someone who agrees with them, then all of a sudden the terminology gets softened. As always, the hypocrisy annoys me more than anything. Either people do bad things because they are struggling with something, or they don't. The specifics of who it was shouldn't change that. And I argue on the same side as what they're saying right now. People do bad things because they're struggling with something. But we need to agree that should be our broad conclusion that we're coming to, regardless of who it is. But I'm going to end it there before I end up going on a soapbox rant or my head explodes. My goal is ultimately for just a few people to examine these situations critically enough to start informing positive actions that can prevent more pain and suffering in the future. And I think that's as good a transition as any to our next topic of activism. To kick things off, I want to do a little bit of a visualization exercise today. I want you to imagine that from the time you were born, you wore green tinted glasses. So from age 0 to however old you are now, you've been wearing these green tinted glasses. Now I ask you, how do you see the world? In a word, green, right? That's all you've known, is that the world is a very green place. And you could probably have all sorts of people all around you tell you that that's not the way the world is because they don't wear those green tinted glasses. They see the world completely differently than you. But it's going to be really hard to convince you otherwise because that's all you've known your entire life. And it's not until you can take those glasses off that you can truly understand that things are different than what you originally thought. This is a truth for most human beings, but I think specifically I'm using this example to talk about what it's like to be a trauma survivor. In my opinion, trauma survivors wear their own green-tinted glasses because of the experiences they've been through and because of the difficulties they've faced, and also literally because of the way that their brain has been rewired in response to these trauma effects. It's colored their entire perspective and really removed a lot of objectivity from the situation. People who have been through trauma are much more likely to have hostile attribution biases, which is something I've talked about in previous episodes. But to recap, a hostile attribution bias is basically, if you take it word for word, just what it sounds like. You're more likely to have a bias and assume that people around you are acting in a hostile manner. You're more likely to perceive people's intentions as being negative out of greed or laziness or evil, and much less likely to see that there may be some other things going on there, that there may be some outside motives that you hadn't originally thought of that are playing into the situation. You're less likely to engage in perspective taking and really look at things from their point of view. And then on top of that, of course, you just have a lower threshold for anxiety. And when your anxiety is high, that cuts off a lot of the parts of your brain that are responsible for critical thinking. So basically, you're walking through life with less capacity to have full access to the parts of your brain to make really complex and difficult decisions. Now, I'm going to make a leap here, and I could be totally wrong, but I'm posing a hypothesis that many activists are survivors themselves. It would follow that people who feel very strongly about making changes around specific injustices and problems in society are people who have either directly encountered those things or had people close to them encounter those things. Ergo, these people are trauma survivors, and they want to fight for other trauma survivors like them. And that's a good thing. Those are good intentions. It's good that you care enough about not only what happened to you, but also about other people that this has happened to, that you want to help them. You want to see fewer people go through what you went through. Those are all fantastic things to do. But unfortunately, as I've said many times before, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, because you've got good intentions. However, you're also wired in such a way that it's really difficult to have a full capacity to engage in these complex arguments. This is ultimately part of the criticism of the Parkland survivors. Especially in the immediate wake of that tragedy, it would be pretty hard to engage in fully rational and objective thinking, and rightly so. Stress reactions are still raw, and any opposition is likely to be seen as coming from some sort of ill motive. We saw this in plenty of debates too. The argument against the other side was often that they don't care about kids and all they care about is guns. And And it's all about money and greed and this and that. They were engaging in that hostile attribution bias. And that's not even to say that they're wrong, but simply it ignores taking off those green tinted glasses. You're very much seeing this from one point of view that you're locked into. Now, some might argue that this emotional aspect serves a purpose, and it certainly garners more attention than cold facts and spreadsheets, I'll give it that. But I ask you, what is the purpose of activism? And does this approach meet that end? It seems like somewhere along the way we forgot that the purpose of activism is to enact real societal changes. If your goal is simply to get people riled up, then emotionally charged press spots and interviews and public debates are certainly an effective strategy for that. You're going to have a lot of eyes on you, you're going to get a lot of attention, and a lot of people are going to react to what you have to say. The problem is that this approach only tends to garner actual support from those who already agree with you, while those on the other side are just going to be more put off and dig their heels in more deeply. If your goal is actually to make change, you're going to need to change some minds along the way, in addition to maintaining your base. Because, let's face it, your side doesn't have enough weight on its own to get the job done. And that, of course, goes for whichever side of the aisle you happen to land on. Changing minds requires a lot more tact and planning than just getting a reaction. You need to see your argument from the other side in as objective a manner as possible. Convey empathy and understanding, and find ways to frame your position as a win for them as well. And let's just be real, as much as we'd like to think so, people don't tend to go in for movements that don't benefit them on some level. Even the people who care the most deeply about making large societal changes and benefiting other people do so partially because they get something out of it. Maybe it even just is the feeling of being an advocate and doing the right thing. So therefore, you're not going to get a lot of traction on actual change unless you really put in that work to find ways to think about, okay, how do I make my argument make sense to the other side? How do I buy them in? I always describe this in counseling when we're trying to get families who are just, burned out and sick of hearing how they're not parenting right and being told what to do all the time. How do I sell my approach to them? How do I get them bought into doing real trauma work and family therapy when they really don't want to? You kind of have to put on your salesman hat and think about, how do I sell this to them? If you're a car salesman, the first thing you want to do is zero in on what do these people actually want in their car. Some people want a great sound system. Some people want it to go really fast and have a great engine. Some people want great gas mileage. Some people want it to be cheap for maintenance. You need to know that first before you tailor your pitch. If you want a great sound system, I'm going to zero in on how great the subwoofer is and how you can blast out the windows. If you want to go really fast, I'm going to tell you how many RPMs it has and what its top speed is. If you want great gas mileage, then those are the points that I'm going to focus in on. And same it is with these more complex political and societal debates. I need to think about, what does the other side care about? What are their concerns about this? And how do I factor that into how I talk about the issue so that I can engage them and make them feel like, one, I'm listening to them, and two, that I'm actively looking for a solution that somehow benefits everyone, at least on some level. And doing that requires a lot of mental chess. There's a lot of calculated planning involved, which brings me back to my original point. Many survivors are not in a place to do that effectively. It's just a reality. Their brains are literally wired against doing that. And that's not to say it's impossible. There's obviously survivors out there who are great speakers and who are able to keep themselves regulated and keep that mental capacity where it needs to be. Some people just handle higher stress situations better than others too. So I'm not absolutely making a blanket statement about this. I never do. I don't like to make generalizations, but I'm just saying on the whole, it's like trying to do calculus while you're running on a treadmill and having someone randomly throw large objects at you that you have to dodge, or trying to give a speech that you've memorized while you're running away from a bear that's attacking you. Studies show that the areas of the brain most critical for navigating these difficult discussions literally go offline. So how are you going to have a thoughtful, relatively objective, and calculated debate when the parts of your brain that do the calculating and that are capable of that perspective taking and objective reasoning are not there? And it may be less engaging to watch people take the Ross Perot route and pull out a whiteboard and cover statistics, but it's a critical part of creating lasting, sustainable solutions. Otherwise, we're just going to wind up with something that crumbles in a couple years, if even that, and often creates new problems that we hadn't thought of. That happens all the time. Even more importantly, without engaging at that level in these debates, all we have is an ever-increasing divide leading to more and more political gridlock, where we're just stuck, and we're going to get to a point where nothing can move forward at all. And stagnation is one of the worst outcomes I can think of. Now, mind you, I'm not at all saying that survivors shouldn't be activists or that their voices don't matter. They absolutely do. And their thoughts and feelings are real. I talk to these people all the time. I've dedicated my work to helping these people and helping them engage in very functional lives, and often have encouraged them to become mentors and activists and whatnot if that was an interest area. I'm merely pointing out that guiding big, complex decisions based on a foundation of fear and anxiety alone is not a recipe for success. It's really as simple as that. What I'm really calling for here is a return to valuing logic over emotion. And again, not saying that emotion doesn't matter and that emotion doesn't need to be factored in. But again, when it comes to these big ticket problems, there's a lot more logic that needs to be played into the decision than simply how people feel about it. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you as always for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I will leave you with the words of our wise sages Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan in saying, "Be excellent to each other and party on, dudes."